it's Jessica DeMassa with WTF Health. What's the future health? I'm talking to the who's who of health tech and healthcare innovation. And today, we are going to find out exactly what happens when a health tech startup decides to shut down. And here to share her story, very bravely, I must say, is the co-founder and CEO of Astarte Medical, Tracy Warren. Tracy, it's so good to have you here. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on and talk about this, because this is not a story we hear a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's talk about Astarte Medical and what's going on. So 7 years in, you guys started in 2016, December 2023, you decide that's it. It's over. You decide to shut down. You guys have 8 employees, 4 big hospital contracts. Things are going okay. You guys have raised, $14 million. You closed a Series A plus in 2021, about $7.5 million there.
Mhm.
I mean, Marcus Osborne of Walmart fame is on your board. And then all of a sudden, things are going great and then they're not. So talk to me a little bit about December. Take us back there and tell us, what exactly happened? How did you reach this decision? I read in the Business Insider article that came out earlier that it was your decision. How did you decide that it was time to shut down the company?
Yeah, never a fun experience, but as a former investor, my career was spent being on the other side of the table and being an investor. And probably one of the biggest challenges I think I saw my firm struggle with, and certainly the companies themselves struggle with, is just holding on a little bit too long. And so we worked very hard throughout our history to be very transparent and very disciplined in communicating with our investors, in being strategic about our decisions, and holding ourselves accountable to metrics and milestones that we set for the organization. And so really December culminated in a series of events that we'll probably talk about that really was that time we had to go raise more money if we were going to continue at current course and speed. And when you assess the progress of the business since the last raise in 2019, which you mentioned, we'll talk about the note from the summer, but since we raised external round, the trajectory of the business relative to the requirements of the market didn't match up. And it was, I don't mean to sound too clinical about it, but it was time to sort of be honest with ourselves and with our team about where we were. And that was really the trigger for me, was just taking that hard look at the business, being objective, and trying to make peace with making some pretty tough decisions.
That is a tough decision to make. And I want to unpack every bitty bit of this so that we can learn from your experience and maybe help some other startups that might be out there in a similar spot that you were in, where it's like the runway is looking awfully short. So, okay, let's talk a little bit about, what was going through your head when you decided to call it. What were the things that you were looking at, and what questions were you asking yourself?
Yeah, so I think one of the things we had done, and you mentioned Marcus being on our board, we're very fortunate to have an independent, largely independent board of very successful operating executives who can help us think above the noise of our day-to-day, right? And that's how a board should function. And I feel incredibly fortunate that we have that. We actually had engaged an investment bank early in 2023. So this is before Silicon Valley tanked and sort of that market started to go askew, but we knew we had to raise, and we had a group come in and really do, honestly, an assessment of where we are in the market and talk to large players. The idea being that we would raise capital and then exit, which was kind of our time frame, right? We'd be at that sort of 8-year mark. It's really probably time to get there. And they came back with some very consistent criteria from the market, independent of us, right? And that's, I think I would encourage all CEOs to get independent opinions that had very specific criteria. And probably the most specific one that's relevant to this conversation is we needed 6 to 8 hospital contracts to hit that next level of interest from strategic partners, from the funds that we would be targeting for that next round. And at the beginning of the year, we were at 3, and at the end of the year, we were at 4. And so that, to me, was probably one of the most important criteria of the trajectory to get that, was not hitting sort of the slope that it needed to meet that criteria. And we invested very heavily in our sales efforts and could not make it happen in a time frame that seemed reasonable. So it was kind of coming to terms with what the market was telling us and being honest about the progress.
Talk a little bit about the market there, because I mean, there's a lot of finger pointing going on right now with a lot of startups that are shutting down or becoming delisted from this. I mean, what do you think has contributed really outside of the things that you could control to kind of the fact that the business wasn't able to get those contracts that it needed?
So I'll start really with the hospitals, right? And so hospital sales cycles are long and tedious, and quite frankly, they buy widgets better than they buy software. So as much as health systems will stand up and talk about innovation, have chief innovation officers, et cetera, very few actually implement beyond what they want to be free pilots, enterprise servicing software, especially at the clinical front. And so I think there was an assumption, or maybe I would call it maybe a hope, that with COVID and their need and requirement to adopt digital solutions, telehealth took off, remote monitoring, a lot of digitally played applications, that they now figured out how to buy these digital solutions, and that when COVID was over, it was going to be better. And I think that's where, in my opinion, a lot of the hype in 2021, and we raised money on this as well, right? We had not really sold during COVID. It was sort of inappropriate to call on these hospital customers during that time. So you asked yourself, well, now they can adopt digital solutions. Let's get in there, and we've got a strong value proposition, et cetera. And we saw a little bit of that, but it was very short-lived. And hospitals then had to deal with the continuing budget crisis, right? They got an influx of cash, perhaps, from any kind of bolus of government funding, but their business had fundamentally changed, and then they had the workforce shortages, obviously. So they just keep getting deeper into quicksand, from my perspective. And it's, again, I think it's well intentioned, but the idea that what they did during a crisis was going to become the new norm was a misperception across the board. And while there are good intentions, I just don't think that ever materialized. So I think the hospital sales cycles are still long and tough. And I do think software is a different beast from an acquisition perspective. You give them a device, they know the procurement, they know the value committees, you know what you're doing. Software is still this really tough purchasing process, evaluation and purchasing. So I think that's not getting better. On the investor side, right? And I've been in a VC since 2001. There are always hypes, right? There are always these fads, and there are always the great unicorn stories that become desolate, that nobody talks about, right? But we talk about them during the hype. And there are a lot of, to your point, people who rush to the flame, right? Flies to the flame. And so I think what happened in that is it seemed so oversold. You had to be cool. You had to do digital health. It was something a lot of people who didn't understand it invested in and are learning lessons. And there are some really great digital health success stories too. So the whole area isn't terrible, but finding that sweet spot is still quite difficult. And so I think that's where I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater on digital health, but investors had a lot of learning to do, and they dumped a lot of capital, probably prematurely, from really understanding those market dynamics.
The investors, then, I'm hearing you say, they have kind of learned their lesson, but do you think the hospitals have learned their lesson? I'm like listening to you talk about the buying cycle, especially for software, and thank you for carving that out, because I think that's a really important distinction to make. But do you feel like they've been learning their lesson too, as they've gone through this whole pre-COVID, COVID, post-COVID period of time, in terms of like how they bought digital during pandemic to how now they're looking at the integration of that digital, it seems like, and starting to make decisions? Do you feel like they've learned their lesson in terms of buying into digital health?
I laugh a little bit just because it depends on my mood. So I will say that in my most cynical, I would say they were never, unless they're forced to, and I think that's what the pandemic did demand, right? They're okay to not jump into stuff. And I would say, in 5 years, I think we'll be saying the same thing about AI. There's a lot of talk. There's a couple of big groups that will do something, and certainly some companies that will be successful, but it's likely to be, especially knowing what we know from being at the data side of digital health, AI in mainstream is, in my mind, a little premature to know exactly what that looks like. So I think that digital health at the time was a hype, and I don't think hospitals are penalized for not innovating. So, you have a champion at a hospital who loves your solution, will kind of go to the mat. But if the system keeps beating them down and there's 50 people who can veto it, who will get paid the same and show up the next day, and their review at the end of the year won't have anything to do with innovation, they're going to keep doing what they're doing because there's no risk to it. So I do think there's actually an incentive call to health systems that until you make it part of someone's compensation, either administratively or, on the clinical side, the status quo, they will not get fired for it, right? And so there's just this inertia that fell back into the system. They were exhausted, right? They were spent. They had other fires they were fighting, and innovation is just still this sort of afterthought. And I think there's just a reset that needs to happen in some of the cultural aspects of these health systems before they'll change. That's just my opinion.
I think that's well, you have a well qualified opinion based on your experience. So thank you for sharing that. All right, take us back. I really want to hear about your experience as a CEO here and how this all, how shutting down kind of went, unpacked for the company and the different stakeholders in it. And so it's like we've been talking a lot about, the economic conditions around what happened, but take this home, bring this back into Astarte Medical, and let's talk about how this unfolded. So back in December, you tell the board, right? That was your first go-to. Tell the board what you're going to do, and then what happened? Like, I mean, tell me, did the employees? How did you tell the employees? I mean, you had a team of 8. Do you think they saw the writing on the wall? Like, was it a surprise? Like, or were they genuinely floored when you told them that this was the decision and the direction the company was headed?
So it's interesting. I started really with my executive team on just like, here's where we're headed. We're going to talk to the board, talk to the team, talk to the investors. It was a mixed bag. I guess the people I thought knew it was coming were surprised, and the people that I thought would be surprised had made peace with it, or were just sort of joined the company knowing the risk and never felt. And we're very transparent. So we're 8 people. We are in the office. People hear me on the phone pitching. They hear me talking to bankers. They hear everything, right? We're a very tight group, and I have an exceptional team. And that closeness allowed us to be very clear about, they knew the contracts weren't coming, right? They knew we weren't implementing new customers. Like, it wasn't that we were hiding anything. We also wanted to give hope, right? You also have that. And that, I think, from a CEO perspective, is the hardest part.
How do you balance that?
Balancing your both internal and external face. Until you're 100% sure, you have to go balls to the walls like it's going forward, and you're super excited about it. And all your doubt, it's left at the door. You do not bring that to the meetings or to the calls or to the team. And so that was probably the hardest part for me. Was it felt like a head fake to a couple people. And I think that's where I had started talking to investors in November and just reading some of the tea leaves, so groups that were like, hey, talk to us after JP Morgan. We weren't going to be there after JP Morgan. So, it was that kind of head fake stuff that made me feel a little bit, just kind of two-faced, for lack of a better word. And that was probably the hardest thing for me, because I'm a very, exactly where you stand with me at all times kind of person. And that took a lot of energy. And I think until we communicated the decision, that was a huger burden than I had appreciated that I was carrying. So told the board, and some of our investors are observers, so they knew, told my largest investor, who's not on my board, and they were fantastic. Not saying that they weren't disappointed, but just so professional. And again, we'd given adequate updates and not surprised them with anything. And then the team was the hardest part. And we had to tell them on December 21st, which was the worst
right before Christmas
possible situation.
Yeah.
But just because of people's vacations, and we wanted to be able to give severance that was at least meaningful to folks, the timing ended up being the Thursday before Christmas. And it was horrible. However, I would say, again, such amazing human beings. And I don't think telling them, it didn't probably hit them until 24 to 48 hours later. And so between my CTO and I, we just kept touching the folks, like email, chat, how you doing? Got any questions? And then the team came back together in January for a couple weeks. So we had a chance to kind of address concerns, but people think they're ready for this and some are not. And you just don't know how to coach someone into that.
No, I mean, that is a really challenging position to be in. I can't imagine you yourself have been in this position before. And so it's like, what do you do? I mean, that's really tough. And I'm really sorry that you and your team had to go through that, especially right before the holidays, because that adds that extra layer, of just emotion, to the whole process. I mean, that's just really tough. Do you have any advice that you would pass on, having lived through probably like the worst timing around that and how that could go down? I mean, what advice would you pass on to another CEO? And like one of the things I'm noticing about, as you're talking about this is it's like it wasn't one moment. It's just like this whole it keeps going, kind of mushroom clouding out. And so maybe speak a little bit to that too. Is this like how do you, as the person who's got to be, the face and the voice and the figurehead and the person setting the direction, how do you keep going through all of this for this extended period of time that is, shutting down? I mean, we can talk a little bit about this more later, but, first your advice and then, to that point, talk about, enduring for the marathon that this is.
Yeah. One thing I would say is as an investor, one of my biggest pet peeves was being surprised by investment companies and portfolio companies. And so I think as a CEO, I work extremely hard that my board and my investors are never surprised by anything, meaning sharing some of the struggles. You don't have to be explicit. And you certainly don't want to solicit advice from all your investors because it'll just murky the waters. But I think you have to be transparent about your challenges all the way. Like so many people go out and just sell the moonshot and they just sell the happiness and they just sell. And I think they do themselves a disservice because then there's all these questions why. So my board, especially, and my investors, right? We didn't know coming out of COVID. We had 3 contracts in the first year and a half after that. And so was it COVID? Was it the product? Was it our sales strategy? We didn't know. And because of the pandemic and that weird kind of sorting out, we didn't know. And so we kind of ticked off eat the elephant in pieces kind of thing. We started to do different things. So we changed our sales strategy. We brought in a lead gen firm. We brought in a sales coach for my team. Like we just invested in what we thought was our biggest. And with that investment, we didn't see a greater yield. And so whether it was the hospitals or whether it was a product, there was nothing that I could point to that said, if we did this differently, the next 6 to 12 months are going to look differently. And I think that's for me where it's like pivoting is great. And I do believe you have to have wiggle room to pivot and explore new strategies. And maybe it's a different, market segment. You go to employers or payers, or that didn't work. That wasn't our path. But you have to have room to pivot as a CEO, but you also have to be realistic that if you don't see something you can point to that you can mitigate a risk through in a period of time that is acceptable to investors, which is usually months, not years, despite what they say, don't jump in and think that you'll just kind of BS your way through it. Like, be honest about what that's going to take. And for us, that was sort of, we didn't see how the hospitals were going to dramatically change. We didn't see VC coming earlier stage, right? And if anything, they were going earlier, just getting out of the game altogether. So if those two things are true, there was nothing we as a company could do to change our future. And that's where I think, so my advice is to be transparent, set out your biggest, ugliest challenges, and then put a strategy in place. And if your investment of time and energy and money doesn't yield, you got to have that conversation with yourself and with your stakeholders.
I think that's great advice about how systematic to be in terms of your evaluation. Like, I love that it was very time bound. I love that you had, you kind of isolated each of the factors and evaluated them separately to see which thing you could fix. You took control of the thing that you could control. You invested more in your sales, and then still when it didn't yield the results, that was another way to know. So I like how like systematic your evaluation process was there. That is very investor like of you.
I
So
know.
speaking of investors, you've mentioned them, and I like your little nugget of advice that was tucked in there about not asking all your investors, because that's just murkies up the waters. But talk about the relationship with your investors through this process. I want to hear a little bit about that, because from as somebody who covers a lot of fundraising and talking about the slate of investors who are jumping into a round or whatever, you hear a lot about the good side of that relationship and the vetting that goes on when investment is made to make sure it's a great fit and everybody's all aligned. But it's like you don't often hear about what happens in that relationship, which is really sensitive relationship in in this entrepreneurial space, right? The relationship between startup CEO and investors. What happens when the business has to shut down, and the risk that was taken is not going to net out. So talk to me about how your investors were involved. And I specifically want to know, like, when in the process did you bring them in? Like, I know you said you're a no surprises person, so they were kind of given information along the way, but like, at what point did you bring them into the conversation about, like, okay, that this looks like it is heading in a downward direction and we're going to be shutting down if this doesn't happen? I mean, was this at that point where you guys took on the additional debt funding in the summer, or like at what point did you really bring them into the conversation, and how did that go?
Yeah, great. And so I think again, I question whether being a former investor makes me a better or worse CEO, because I do switch hats a little bit.
That's honest.
But I'm a large investor in this company, and I'm still a huge believer in our mission and our goals. So but to answer your question, we raised a note this summer. So just like a lot of, I think, companies, right? You went to your insiders when the market sort of got confused with SVB and it wasn't really clear what investment was going to look like. So we also did a note this summer. And I would tell you, reviewing that pitch deck was one of the criteria when I looked to whether or not we would go forward with the business. And so having just told my investors this summer, so we closed a note around June, July, what we needed to accomplish. And again, there were 4 very specific things. We got 3 of the 4, but sales was the 4th, and probably arguably the most important from an external assessment perspective. So anything in our control, we executed on. Anything outside our control, we continued to struggle with. But when I talked to them this summer, the conversation was, I don't believe in bridge after bridge, convertible note after convertible note, right? I don't believe in them. Like, a bridge should be a bridge to something that should be written in ink, that you don't go back and rewrite history or move that yardstick. And if we fail to meet it, I said, we'll have a different conversation at the end of the year. And so, we got participation from all of our large investors, many of our angel investors, and I wanted to be true to that conversation. So I don't think, to your point about the respect the relationship, right? Like,
Yeah.
I made a deal with them, if you will, on behalf of the company. We did everything in our power, and I do believe my team could not have done more. And we still couldn't make a difference. Okay, then respect that relationship, respect that you took that money with criteria that you agreed to be assessed by, and we missed it, right? And so I think for me, it was more, those relationships are very important to me. My board is world class, and they're strategic, and they are able to look above who's, money rate. The business was struggling, and it did not behoove us to go out and raise a bunch of money, maybe from people who didn't know our space. Or, I mean, the number of people who told me to go to internationally or go to people who were, didn't know anything about our space, like, that is just not me. Like, if intelligent investors can't get the deal done, you probably should ask yourself what that business really looks like.
I saw too, I was going to say, in the Business Insider article that you had talked about, being pushed to kind of go in the direction of AI, and talking about AI as a part of your business that would hopefully make it a little bit more attractive. And you said no. which I
Yeah.
think is really awesome. Like, I don't think, I mean, I want to give you like all the credit in the world for really knowing what you are and what you aren't, and being able to say, no, like, the
Yeah.
alternative is to shut down or, to raise money under false pretenses. And I'm not going to do that. So, kudos to you for that decision there. I mean, was there more conversation around that about things that you could do to keep going? I mean, because once you're in, right, like that's the pressure that we hear a lot about, kind of on the periphery, is that like, the investors or board or whoever might push to, or sometimes it's internal, there'll be
Yeah.
a push to keep going, even when it's like all systems are no. So, I mean,
Right.
say a little bit about that, I mean, about kind of, the other options that were thrown your way so that we can, hear about that.
Yeah.
And then also, the fortitude that it takes to say, no, not who we are.
Yeah. And the irony there is we've actually done work in machine learning and predictive models. We've done it since 2018 around gut health in babies and predicting growth failure in babies. We've published on it actually. So it's not even like I didn't have a leg to stand on in AI, or if you will. The bigger reality is, and I don't know that people want to talk about this, but our product today works inside the electronic medical record, right? We sit within the EMR with our clinical decision support. I know how messy healthcare data is, right? There are a lot of challenges in the idea of using that to predict care because it isn't perfect and it isn't clean. And especially in our vulnerable patient population, the idea that I was going to go out and suggest that our tools would be pointed at what we know to be a poor quality source, it seemed honestly, you know, not criminal, but definitely unethical, right? Like, I just don't believe we're there yet. And so, again, when it came down to it, again, I think there will be AI success stories. Making us look like that, knowing what we did and having actual knowledge of what this space looked like, I definitely couldn't have sold that story with an ability to wake up and look at myself in the mirror.
I admire that. I really do. All right. I want to find out a little bit about what's going on right now. So let's talk about your customers, because you guys had hospital contracts and you are working with this very vulnerable population of, babies in NICUs. So what happens to them? Like, how did your customers react? Do you have a transition plan in place? Like, are they transitioned? So what happens? I mean, talk to me about the customer side of this, and take it through onto the patient.
Yeah, and customer continuity was next to taking care of our team, right? That they were hand in hand because those are the people that matter the most to us. Um, so we had conversations shortly after talking to the board and investors and our team with our customers and letting them know that we are actually able to support them through the current contracts. We weren't going to sell any new. We had some products in development. We were going to sort of pause that, but we are still supporting our existing customers. And the hope is that some of the conversations we're having today will be groups that will pick up those contracts. So a lot of the groups that are interested of this becoming part of a larger platform either share those customers or share an interest in those customer profiles. So we made it such that we have runway to support them, but some of our technical team is still around on a consulting basis to help us do that. And we want to continue to support patients as long as humanly possible, without this being a 2-year exercise, right? So I think we've been very, again, transparent with our clients. They get it. They know how hard it is to work and get stuff adopted because they walked that road with us. And so I do think there's acknowledgement, and there's probably even more frustration on their side with other things they've tried to get done. So we are probably just one of several lessons they've learned. And so we got support, we have clear dialogue, and we just keep talking to them about where we are. But my commitment to them is to sort of keep them updated and hopefully find a bigger and better, more capitalized home for them.
And I understand that the assets of Astarte Medical, or some assets, are for sale. So talk to me about what's for sale, and
Yeah.
who the ideal buyer is, because the business is like, there's two parts to it, right? There's the software part of it, and then there's more of like a life sciences component. So say a little bit about that,
Yeah.
and give us, yeah, let us know how that's going too, because that's another interesting aspect of it, is that you're still living on, trying to take the assets that you do have, taking care of your customers, and then also take these assets and find them new homes. Talk to me
Right.
about that.
Yeah. So, and I think from a investor perspective, right, we want to create as much optionality and opportunity for our investors to recuperate their capital. So we have two real core pieces. Our clinical decision support platform, which, as you know, is around nutrition and preterm infants, is actually a series of tools that is extremely good at liberating data from the electronic medical record, organizing it, adding protocols and standardization, and then measuring. And so we have a group of people we're talking to who like the NICU and the pediatric space. It's a short list, unfortunately,
Yeah.
because pediatrics is so poorly served, which is why we started this. And then we have groups that are actually looking more broadly at adult populations, but who want to look at sort of this standardization, clinical effectiveness, and want to use the tools to then be adapted to other use cases. And so from the platform perspective, we've got different parties interested in either of those, either as a set of tools, which is largely code, and or the application into nutrition and pediatric nutrition. So those are the groups we're talking to, largely groups that have the sales and contracts already, right? One thing I don't want to do is just lump with another startup that also is going to see inevitably the same struggles we have. I don't think it's unique to us. And then on the other side of our business, we've done a lot of work in gut health and particularly in microbiome-based therapies. So our long-term vision has always been that children should be assessed on almost a personal basis on diet, antibiotic exposure, really trying to help address some of the chronic conditions that our kids face today. And so we have intellectual property, 3 issued patents and a pending one around quantifying gut health, creating health plans around gut health, and they're agnostic of it being a pediatric population. They're just the idea that better data around what's different between your gut and my gut and why your diet should be X and mine should be Y, and how that helps us live a longer, healthier life without medications, that's really the future of medicine. And so I think that part of our business is still research. We've had some publications, but it needs a home in a group that really believes in sort of that precision care, precision medicine side of things.
I can still hear how like hopeful and excited you are
Always.
about like the future of health, which is just like it's like I mean you're getting me a little like choked up here because it's just it's unfortunate that it didn't work in this circumstance. And I cannot thank you enough for just sharing your story and your insights in such like a very straightforward, honest, real, authentic way. Like I really can't thank you enough for that. And then to just hear your excitement about it. So, I want to end our conversation, talk you. I want to hear how you're doing. I mean, like the thing that I'm taking away from this is, we read in the various forms of media here about the shutdown, about the day everybody gets laid off or the day things close. But it's like what I'm understanding from you, and this is I think because we don't hear from CEOs of startups that are shutting down, is just how long this process is. I mean, Tracy, my God, like this goes all the way back to the summer, maybe even before, and you're still living it today. So how are you? Like, how do you feel? I mean, going through all of this, like, I mean, what would you say to other CEOs of other startups who might be in the same position where, shutting down is definitely an option on the table? Like, what's your last words of advice? Let us know how you're doing and what you would say to them.
Yeah, thanks for asking. I'm doing okay. Like I said, I literally believe 100% in what we set out to do. I could still pitch it and could stand up on stage and give you all the reasons why it's a great
I can
idea.
tell.
Yeah, I mean, I have zero regrets. I really do have zero regrets. I have met amazing people as part of this journey. We've created an amazing product. We've had impact on patient lives who not a lot of people can say that. And so I'm very proud of what we've done. Did I cry often? Yes, for sure. It sucks. It totally
Yeah.
sucks. Because these are people you respect and people you care about, and you have to feel like you're letting them down. That's just human nature, right? And it is about the people. I would do this again with the same team doing, I don't know, widgets of some kind. Like these are great human beings. So I have good days and bad days. And I definitely, when I have to talk about it, when I told the board, tears everywhere. Not my favorite moment as far as staying professional. But the one thing you said sort of advice, like as a CEO, it's very hard. Again, that balance of keeping people positive and focused and engaged and being realistic about the business is have strong advisors. And so my board is phenomenal, and have people outside the company that do what you do. So whether it's another CEO or just another experienced business person, that you can really lay it all out. And I'm also a big proponent of mental health. So I have psychologists I see, like I believe in all of that. You have to be balanced, and taking care of yourself. So, I have 3 teenagers that I also get to manage. And so you gotta make space, so that nobody gets lost in this, not the business side and definitely not the personal side. And so I would just say, lean on people. Being a CEO is fine, but shit rolls uphill often, and you got to be able to share the load. And that's really where I think, again, focus on mental and physical health. It's really important to take care of yourself during all of this.
Does it help to talk about it?
It does. And again, I think you have to have a spectrum, right? It helps to talk about it to, I'll say more the corporate side and the business side, because you want your team to understand that you did everything possible, right? You want your board and investors to know that you're still committed. You're not giving up just because, again, the business operationally may be kind of paused, but my commitment to the business isn't changing, right? So talk about it. And because I do think if you don't talk about it, people assume or rumors start. And so if you don't control the conversation, only bad things can happen. Nobody's going to go out and be like, yeah, I'm sure that this great thing is happening to this company because we've heard nothing, right? Like talk about it.
Right.
And I think part of the opportunity here and what I hope to inspire is that, look, stuff happens, right? We talk about the good way too much and we don't balance it with the bad. And that's why people who have bad experiences think they're failures. And it's not true. If you don't take risks, you don't have anything to lose. So talk about it. Like, I'm sure I made mistakes. There are 100% chance that's true. Am I going to resolve them by just sitting in a corner feeling sorry for myself or letting somebody else tell my story? Absolutely not. So I think talking about it helps. Some you're in tears with wine, some you're in front of a boardroom and you're sort of, telling or talking to a great reporter. Like, you tell the story.
Thanks.
Like take the stigma out of it.
Well, Tracy, thank you for talking to me. Next time, this should definitely have a glass of wine with it
Done.
somewhere. I would love that. But I mean, I'm blown away. I'm blown away by your candor. I'm blown away just by the fearlessness with which you've approached this conversation, and also the fearlessness with you've approached looking at your business for the last 9 months, 10 months, and deciding, no, this needs to stop. And I think that you need to be commended for that. Like, congratulations on making a really hard decision and for sharing the insight that you gleaned from going through that process with all of us here today. I can't thank you enough, because I mean, it's really great to talk about the rainbows and the unicorns and the $1 million funding rounds, but it also needs this conversation about what happens when we shut down also needs to have a place in our story here. So thank you. I really appreciate you coming by and sharing with us.
Well, thanks for having me, Jessica, and for giving me a platform to do so. Really appreciate it.
All right. Well, for those of you who want to find out more about those who are changing the way that we do healthcare, all those companies out there who are still plugging along, and those who might be, taking to heart some of the good advice we received here today, you can head on over to my YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/WTF Health. I'm Jessica DeMassa. Thank you again to Tracy Warren, the co-founder and CEO of Astarte Medical. We'll talk to you guys real soon. Take care. Bye.